The knock came at 6 in the morning, 3 sharp raps. Adaeze Nwosu's hand froze over her coffee. Nobody knocked like that unless it was bad news. She opened the door. A courier held out a thick envelope. Sign here. 47 letters, rubber-banded tight, every single one addressed to her, every single one stamped in angry red, past due, final notice, collections. Her hands shook as she flipped through them. Her name was on every envelope, but none of the addresses were hers. Her mother's house, her brother's apartment, an electric company in a town she left 6 years ago. Someone had been using her name, and they'd been doing it since the day she walked out of her family's house for good. If this is the kind of story that keeps you up at night, wondering what you'd do in her shoes, hit subscribe, tap that like button, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight. You're going to want to see how this one ends. 3 years earlier, the day Adaeze moved out, her family had thrown a party. Not for her, not exactly. They called it a celebration, balloons taped to the porch railing, her mother's famous jollof rice steaming on the table, laughter spilling out into the yard of their house in Charlotte. Adaeze remembered standing in the doorway with her last suitcase, watching her older brother Chidi raise a glass and announce, "Finally some peace in this house." Everyone laughed. Even her mother, Ngozi, laughed, though her eyes didn't quite join in. Adaeze told herself it didn't matter. She was 26, she had a new job 2 hours away, and she was tired, so tired of being the one who paid for everything and got nothing back but resentment. She had been the responsible one her whole life, the one who covered rent when her father's construction business went under, the one who paid Chidi's community college tuition after he dropped out twice, the one who quietly slipped money into her mother's purse so nobody would know the lights had almost been shut off. And what she got in return was a family who treated her success like a debt she owed them, and her boundaries like betrayal. So when the promotion came through, she left. Clean break, she thought. New apartment, new city, new life. She hugged her mother at the door, and Ngozi held on a beat too long, whispering something Adaeze couldn't quite hear over the music. She would think about that whisper for years. For the first few months, freedom felt like breathing after being underwater. She furnished her small apartment herself, piece by piece. She started therapy. She began, for the first time in her adult life, to sleep through the night without her phone buzzing with a relative's emergency. She told herself the silence from her family was a gift. But silence, she would learn, is never really silence. It's just information you haven't received yet. The first letter arrived 8 months after she moved. A collections notice for a credit card she had never opened, in her name, with a Charlotte address that used to be her childhood bedroom. She called the bank, confused, assuming fraud, assuming some stranger had stolen her identity. The representative on the phone read her the account details, and Adaeze's stomach dropped. The card had been opened using her social security number, yes, but activated at an address only 4 people in the world knew was ever hers. She didn't say anything to her family, not yet. She told herself it was a mistake, a clerical error, something explainable. She wanted, desperately, to believe that. She should have known better. She had grown up in a house where love and debt were the same currency, where her mother said, "Family helps family," the way other people said grace before dinner, meaning it as both a blessing and a demand. But Adaeze had spent 3 years building distance, and distance, she thought, meant safety. She was wrong, and the second letter proved it. The second one came 4 months after the first. A different creditor, a furniture store this time, $3,000 past due, financed under her name, delivered to Chidi's new apartment. She remembered sitting on her kitchen floor with that letter in her hands, feeling something cold slide down her spine. 2 coincidences were not a coincidence. Someone in her family had her personal information memorized, or worse, still had access to it, and they were spending money they knew she would eventually have to answer for. This time, she called her mother. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told Adaeze everything before a single word was spoken. "Adaeze, whatever this is, can it wait? I'm making dinner. There's a debt in my name at Chidi's address. Do you know anything about that?" Another pause, longer this time. You know your brother's been struggling. He didn't want to worry you. He didn't want to worry me, so he stole my identity? Nobody stole anything. You're his sister. Family shares. Adaeze sat in silence for a long moment, the phone hot against her ear, her chest tight with a feeling she didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't quite anger. It was closer to grief, the specific grief of realizing the people who were supposed to protect you had instead been quietly, patiently using you as a resource to be mined. If you've ever had a family member cross a line and then act like you were the unreasonable one for noticing, comment below and let us know, because this story is only getting started. And if it's already hitting close to home, go ahead and like this video right now. For a while, Adaeze tried to fix it the quiet way. She disputed the accounts. She froze her credit. She sent a certified letter to her mother's house, demanding that whoever had used her information stop immediately. She thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 6 weeks later, a third letter arrived, this one from a medical billing office, $4,000, an emergency room visit under her name at a hospital 40 minutes from her mother's house. On a date Adaeze had been at work in another city, badge swiped into her office building with a timestamp that would prove it. She began to understand, slowly and with a sickness rising in her throat, that this wasn't one desperate mistake. This was a pattern, a system. Someone had built an entire secondary life on the foundation of her identity, and they had been doing it for longer than she wanted to imagine. She drove to Charlotte that weekend without calling ahead. She needed to see her mother's face when she asked the question that had been eating her alive. How many? How many accounts? How many debts? How many times had her name been used like a spare key to a house she no longer lived in? Her mother answered the door with the practiced calm of a woman who'd already rehearsed her innocence. But her father, silent in his armchair for most of the conversation, was the one who finally cracked. He wouldn't meet Adaeze's eyes when he said it. It started before you even left Adaeze's, the month before. Your mother took out a loan in your name to keep the house. She said you'd understand. She said you always understood. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her before she left. The party, the balloons, the toast to peace in the house, all of it had happened after her mother had already begun quietly building debt onto her daughter's back, timing it, perhaps, so that Adaeze's exit would look voluntary instead of engineered. She thought of the whisper at the door the day she moved out, the one she could never quite make out. Now she wondered if it had been an apology or a confession, or something colder than either. How much? Adaeze asked, her voice flat in a way that frightened even her. How much is it all together? Her mother finally spoke, and her voice cracked in a way that might have been shame, or might have been performance. Adaeze could no longer tell the difference. I don't know exactly. Your brother handled some of it too. We were going to pay it back. With what money? You don't have money. That's why you took mine. Nobody answered that. Nobody could. If you've ever discovered a truth about the people closest to you that rewrote your entire understanding of your own life, take a second and like this video, because what Adaeze discovers next is going to change the way you see everyone in this story, including her. She spent that night in her old bedroom, the same room where, unbeknownst to her, a credit card bearing her name had been quietly activated. She couldn't sleep. She pulled out her laptop and began requesting her full credit history, every account, every hard inquiry, every address ever associated with her social security number. What came back nearly stopped her heart. It wasn't 3 accounts, it wasn't even 10. It was 47 separate instances of debt, credit lines, medical bills and utility accounts, all tracing back to her name, stretching across 5 years, starting almost 18 months before she'd ever packed a single box to move out. 18 months. That meant the plan, if it could even be called a plan, hadn't started the week she left. It had started while she was still living under that roof. Still handing her mother rent money out of guilt, still believing that her family's love for her was uncomplicated. The party the night she moved wasn't a celebration of her freedom. It was, she now understood with a clarity that felt like a blade sliding between her ribs, a celebration that they no longer needed to hide it from her in person. Once she was gone, There would be distance, time lag, plausible deniability. Bills could pile up for months before she noticed, and they had counted on exactly that. She confronted Chidi the next morning in the driveway before he could avoid her. He didn't deny it the way their mother had. He seemed almost relieved to finally say it out loud. "I was drowning, Adaeze. The gambling, it got bad, worse than you know. Mom said your info was already on file for the house stuff, that it wouldn't hurt anything, that you made enough money you'd never even notice." "I noticed everything. I've been paying for this family my whole life, and none of you ever once asked if I could afford to keep doing it." "You always could, though. That's the thing. You always figured it out." That sentence would haunt Adaeze more than almost anything else said that weekend, because it revealed something she had never let herself fully see. To her family, her competence hadn't been a gift she gave freely. It had been a resource they assumed was inexhaustible, a well they were entitled to keep drawing from as long as it kept producing water. If you're starting to realize this story is about more than money, you're right, and we need you to comment the moment you figured that out, because what happens next changes everything you think you know about who the real victim is here. Adaeze did not scream. She did not cry. Not there in that driveway, not in front of them. She drove back to her apartment in silence, and for 3 days she barely spoke to anyone. On the 4th day, she called a lawyer. Not to punish her family out of spite, she told herself, though some small, honest part of her knew spite was in there somewhere too, tangled up with the grief. She called because 47 accounts of fraud did not simply disappear because the people responsible were family. Her credit was in ruins. Collectors were calling her at work. A landlord had denied her application for a new lease because of a debt-to-income ratio built almost entirely out of accounts she never opened. Her family's secret had become her present-tense catastrophe, and no amount of blood relation was going to unmake that. The lawyer laid it out plainly. Identity theft, even within families, was prosecutable. Adaeze could file police reports, dispute every fraudulent account formally with documentation, and, if she chose, pursue charges against her mother and brother. The lawyer did not tell her what to choose. She only said, "Some people need consequences before they understand the weight of what they did. Only you know if your family is capable of understanding that weight any other way." Adaeze thought of her mother's whispered words at the door, words she still could not fully recall, and she wondered whether some part of her, even then, 3 years ago, had already sensed the shape of the betrayal waiting for her. Maybe that was why she'd left with a suitcase instead of a single box. Maybe some quiet, unacknowledged instinct in her had known she would need to be ready to run. This is the moment where the story could have ended in silence, the way so many family betrayals do, swallowed and never spoken of again. But Adaeze had spent her whole life keeping the peace for people who never once kept it for her. And she decided, sitting alone in her apartment with 47 letters spread across her kitchen table like a crime scene, that this would be the last debt she paid on someone else's behalf. She filed the police reports. She disputed every fraudulent line with documentation the lawyer helped her compile. And she sent her mother one final message, not cruel, not screaming, just true. "I loved you enough to give you everything I had. You took it without asking, and then you celebrated when I left because it meant I couldn't say no anymore. I'm done being the family bank account. I hope you understand that before you lose someone else." Her mother never fully understood it, not in the way Adaeze needed her to. But her father, months later, sent a letter of his own, an actual letter, admitted everything in writing, and began slowly, clumsily, trying to help pay back what could be recovered. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, it was something smaller and more honest, acknowledgement. And sometimes Adaeze would come to learn acknowledgement is the only apology some people are capable of giving. If this story moved you even a little, subscribe right now, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments the biggest lesson you're taking away tonight, because Adaeze's is simple, and it might be the most important thing you hear all week. The people who celebrate your absence were often the ones who needed you gone to keep taking from you in the dark. Love that costs you your whole self was never love to begin with. It was just a debt you were never meant to notice you were paying.